So, but the point though, if I can come back to the Nocturnal Council here, right? Yeah. The point is that this Nocturnal Council, as he says at 952, he says, what do they talk about? They talk about the laws of their own city, what can be learned elsewhere, and whatever branches of learning might contribute to this inquiry. Right? You have to have the best men who are virtuous to be part of this council. If foreigners show up, or if you go to foreign countries, you want to look for people who are capable of laying down laws, of explaining what education is, upbringing. It seems as the 12th book goes, as the whole laws, as you go through the whole laws, you realize the most important things are the customs and laws of a society, the education of the children, and how you're going to bring up infants. These are the most important things. And so, the Nocturnal Council is the council where you'll basically discuss everything, right? The laws of other cities. You meet foreigners. You try to find men of other cities who might know something. And the Nocturnal Council then has to regulate the most important things. For example, visitors. The first thing he says is, merchants who come like migratory birds, they have to be heavily guarded and regulated. Right? Because the merchants are the people that they're always basically just traveling for money. And money is always the source of innovation that leads to injustice. Right? So you always have to be concerned about how money will be used by these kind of people. The second kind of observer, which they can let in, is the guy that's just a traveler, right? It's kind of interesting. He says travelers should have lodgings prepared near the temples. They should have hotels near churches, right? And then they should be treated with hospitality. They should have priests and the custodians of the temples to take care of them. The third kind of traveler is like a diplomat, and then those kind of people you just treat with official respect. The fourth kind of traveler, basically, I think he says this at 953c, is a philosopher from another city. Basically, I think what he describes there is a philosopher from another city, and that kind of traveler too, you want to show them what's good and what's beautiful in the city.
I like how it says you should not be less than 50 years old.
Yeah, to be on the Nocturnal Council, you got to be, because why? You have to have a basic philosophical knowledge. You have to know very well the laws, and you have to have a lot of experience. And that's another way in which Platonic philosophy, and I think Aristotelian and Thomistic, really strikes against modern philosophy. Right? Because modern philosophy is all ideas before experience. Right? All of Descartes is a priori. All of Kant. Kant says if you can't prove metaphysics before experience, forget about it. If you can't prove morality before experience, forget about it. And so Kant has led to the destruction of millions of souls. I hate to say it, right? But I think it's true, because you can't do anything in Kant's system before experience, which means what you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up recreating reality according to your idea of things. Right? How can I be wrong when it feels so right? As Jane Fonda is trying to shoot down American pilots in Vietnam, right? She can say, how can I be wrong when it feels so right? And for that, she gets invited to speak at the YWCA in South Bend.
She spoke on campus.
Oh, that's true. She spoke on campus, too. Even worse.
Even worse.
Then in 954, he gives all these concerns about how to basically make sure judicial procedure is done properly, so there's no interventions in it. 955, you can't keep someone else's stolen goods. He wants to protect very much against private citizens trying to make peace or war on their own, because that will lead to civil strife in society. 955d, he says, people should want to serve their fatherland with a kind of sense of loyalty, not expecting any payment back for the good that they do for their city. Then again, in 956b and c, He says the citizens should approach judicial procedures not really as if they're going to judges, but if they're going to arbiters or arbitrators. In other words, the citizen who has the true conception of justice doesn't see the law court as doling out a punishment so much as the law court as helping the citizens come to an agreement about things. So arbitration, he says, is a better way of discussing the important things of the city. Now, the Nocturnal Council, 957b, what does it do? It considers laws from other cities. It considers them, considers their value, it corrects them if they're in error, and it will test them by experience. I mean, the Nocturnal Council, to me, it just sounds exactly like the Roman Curia. Right? The whole point of the Nocturnal Council is to look at laws, experience, and practices, and to filter them to make sure that whatever is part of the upbringing and the education of the children is something that helps lead them to virtue. Right? That's the whole point of the Nocturnal Council. And I think what he's suggesting by the Nocturnal Council, he's saying this can only be done by someone who's kind of a philosopher, who's an older person that has a sense of the common good, that has experience, and who has shown that he has the virtues, who has manifested in his life the four cardinal virtues. Only that kind of person can be trusted with keeping an eye on the city. Right? Because what does this person do? This person understands that law, while it's not law is not the only thing, but law is a very important thing. This is 957c. Law is a very important thing because law helps us attain justice. And the true lawgiver, the true statesman, will know what true law is, what real intelligence is, or nous here, he's saying nous. Nous is the capacity to understand the divine. And he will know the true lawgiver will know how to harmonize poems and all other kinds of daily speech and all other stories in society. He will know how to harmonize those so that the citizens will correct what is bad and support what is good. And this can only be done by someone who has a kind of philosophical spirit. And then comes death, 958d. That's perfect background music for death. Right? Then comes death. For anyone who has lived in a good society, for anybody who lives, death comes. Right? It's something that's part of human nature. And again, in 959b, it's not a big surprise. He says basically that every soul, when it dies, it will give a kind of an account of itself because it's immortal, and it will be judged. So, at 959e, he introduces the Nocturnal Council then in a much more robust way. He says even the guardians of the laws, one of their biggest tasks is to supervise. And I think the way...
Supervise.
Was that planned?
No.
Oh, okay, good. But I think one of the important things about that, again, this is one of those areas where I think to understand the problem is very important. The supervision here is not meant to be, the hermeneutics of suspicion, where the supervisors are controlling you. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to supervise. All right, Chris, you'll see. They're trying to supervise people to make sure that people can live virtue.
Bye, Chris.
Bye, Chris.
Bye, Chris.
Yeah.
Au revoir. They're trying to, for example, one of the things they do, they make sure that people don't cry too much for the dead. Right? Because why? Because if you die, you're entering into real life. If you have an immortal soul, right? This world is just a passing valley of tears. Right? He doesn't say that, but... And he also says something here at 960b. He says, right, what they're not doing is they're not doing things, right? They're not trying to do things. They're not trying to acquire things. They're not trying to settle places, like settle colonies. Ultimately, what the Nocturnal Council is doing, they're trying to make whole what is unfinished, right? And beginning in 960D, he starts to use very interesting language, basically saying that the goal of the Nocturnal Council is to save the city. Right? Their job is to pour out the third libation of wine. Have we poured that out yet? Tonight, the third libation? Have we done the third libation?
Go for it on the carpet.
Right? Right? And what he admits at 960D is that for all that they've done in the laws, in the previous 364 pages, for all they've done in setting up the practical institutions, he admits that they have not yet figured out a way how to save souls. Right? And save souls here is, I think, a double meaning. It means save in the sense of what we might think, like ransom, but it also means to safeguard them or protect them. Right? And so for all that we've done in this whole year of studying Plato, we have not yet figured out, and the Republic kind of ends on a similar note, if you remember. We need a story that will save us. Only a story will save us. Someone who comes back from the dead and can tell us how to guard our souls. Right? So the Nocturnal Council is needed because we have not yet figured out how to save souls. And even the laws are limited in what they can do as far as this goes. The laws give in 960E, the laws give a kind of foundation to this. They prepare us for it, but they don't do it. Somewhat in 961C, he says, just like a boat needs to have an anchor cast somewhere, the city needs to have an anchor cast somewhere to know what will really save it. Right? He asked the question again at 961D, what will really save souls? And what he starts to lay out, and actually he comes back to kind of the classical images that he uses, the pilot, the doctor, the army general. He says, if you think about it, all of these guys, the pilot knows what it means to get a ship safely home. Right? He has the art of running a ship, and he also knows how to get it safely to where it needs to go. He knows the goal. The doctor is the same way. There's a standard of health. The doctor knows what it's like to get someone into a healthy state. And he also, if he's a good doctor, not only does he know what health is, but he knows the art of making the person healthy. The general knows the difference between winning and losing a battle. And hopefully he knows strategy well enough to where he can actually win the battle. He knows what victory means. Well, the same thing applies to a city. Ultimately, the one who is guiding a city should have a kind of intelligence in his soul. Right? He should know the practical things, how to make laws, what are the most important things, the offices and institutions. But the thing that he really needs to know is what is the goal of a city. And you could say, just as a doctor can know what health is, so a statesman can know what the good of a city is. Right? There's an analogy between these things. And unless you know the goal, unless you know the goal of what it means to live together well as humans, what is noble, right, and what is ignoble, unless you know this, unless you proclaim it as a member of the Nocturnal Council, and unless you can defend this in your city will become like a modern university, right? And it will wander haphazardly from faction to faction, from passion to passion. First, the wealthy will dominate it. Then the oligarchs will. Then the pleasure seekers will dominate it. Then the tyrants will dominate it. Then the worst of all people, the promoters of academic freedom, will dominate it. Right? And then we'll have tolerance. And then you can be sure that things are over at that point. Right? As soon as tolerance enters into the scene. So. Well, how do you prevent the university, or how do you prevent a city from haphazardly wandering? St. James has great image here. He says, like, these people that follow their passions, They're like leaves blowing in the wind, right? Yeah, St. James is awesome. His vitriol, kind of against those who follow their passions. It's only like 4 chapters long, the letter of St. James. So it's worth reading. Actually, you could read it one of these times when they have these readings, where you read stuff that's been banned or burned.
Tonight?
Are they having one of those tonight?
Yeah.
To read the book of St. James because it was burned during the Reformation. They tried to get rid of it,
I don't know.
right?
What things?
They have, sometimes late at night on college campuses, they have like 11 o'clock, sometimes they'll have these things where you bring readings things that have been banned or things that have been burned. Right? And then you read them because you share with one another all the subversive stuff that's been burned or banned over the years. Well, what you got to do is you got to show up to these things with real stuff that's been banned and burned that they don't like the book of James, right? Or the Summa Theologica, right? Luther burned the Summa Theologica. Or the Way. The Way was burned in the 30s
Really?
in Spain. Yeah.
I think it's funny that the Protestants took out that, and then Sirach too.
Yeah.
It's the most like philosophical.
Yeah.
It's all about, it's like 50 chapters.
So 962D. What does the council really need to aim at? It needs to aim at possessing virtue. Because if you possess virtue, you will not wander and have many aims, but you will look to one aim. And you'll always be shooting to the same end. Cities wander because the laws wander, because those who lead it wander. And eventually, if you let the city wander enough, it'll wander to be ruled by wealth. This is 962E. Or it'll be enslaved by those people that think that because of a spirited zeal, they can set in motion the free way of life. Right? Or you can get the worst thing. People who think they are free and make a lot of money, and so they make despots. They make themselves despots over other cities. Right? So the way you avoid this is by looking to virtue. And I think actually the 4 virtues might correspond to the 4 causes. The way he describes it. Yeah, I think prudence is the final cause. Because prudence corresponds to intelligence, or nous, N-O-U-S.
Foresight, right?
Yeah. Right, so that would be the final cause. And then the formal cause, I think, would be justice. Right, justice is the form of the virtues. Then the efficient cause would be fortitude. And the material cause would be temperance or moderation.
I don't understand how that one makes sense.
Well, because temperance and moderation, they have to do primarily with your body, with your passions, and your emotions, and directing them towards the good. Right? Whereas fortitude has to do more with thumos, which is kind of putting in motion things. To direct yourself towards the truth, and being patient in discovering the truth and in holding to it once you know it. Not letting the passions or desires take over. That's fortitude, I think. Or fear of different things guide your actions. So I think that would be an efficient cause. There's a place
Sounds like a Sudoku puzzle for Friday.
but there's a place in book 12 where he does mention the 4 forms or the 4 causes in relation to the 4 cardinal virtues. And I was thinking about that today, and I think that would fit. This is at 963C. So, and then by 964B, he mentions the 4 cardinal virtues: courage, prudence, moderation, justice. Right? Courage is primarily, it's 963E, courage is primarily concerned with fear. Right? Overcoming fear. And primarily, you have to overcome the fear of dying rather than committing an injustice. By this point, I think these 4 virtues, at least from Plato, we should be familiar with them. Right? Then, the 964E, 965A, the job of these nocturnal council guardians, they should have the best natures, the sharpest souls, They should be at the very top. Their job is to survey, is to watch the city, right? And they keep watch. As they keep watch, they also hand down perceptions and memories, tradition, right? They report everything that they see. And so, they become men of intelligence who can prudently think about all matters that are worthy of discussion. They can deliberate, and they can even use the young, and they can use whatever they want to help them in their collective deliberation. Thus, together with the young, they save the whole city. So that's the Roman Curia. If you think about it, that's what they do. They see the ideal of virtue, and then they consider 965D, 966A. They seal the ideal of virtue, they see the four transcendentals, and then they also try to understand how to make it come into being. And I think here, when he says make it come into being, he doesn't mean like in the Cartesian sense, like you have an idea and you make it come into being, like you're the creator of it. It's more like you see oak trees around you, and you know how oak trees can be healthy trees. And so when you see an oak tree in your backyard, you care for it when it's a sapling, so that it can grow to be a big, strong oak tree. Right? That's how you make it come into being. You're like the farmer who helps the plants that are, the seeds are already there. For the seeds of, Aquinas says this eventually, right? The seeds of the virtues are in all the souls. The seeds of concord and peace and justice are in societies. The point is that if you cultivate your soul, and if you obey, let's say, the church, and which is hopefully trying to help you cultivate your soul, they're the members of it, right? Then you will make the ideals come into being, right? You will make the ideas that are part of God's intellect come into being. It's not that you make the ideas, but it's just like this as a farmer doesn't make corn, right? Or a tree hugger doesn't make the tree. In fact, I was thinking today, if you think about it, modern philosophy is like global warming, right? There's an analogy between modern philosophy and global warming, right? And we're now in the 20th century, we're feeling the effects of 400 years of philosophical global warming. And it's just destroying the moral environment, and wreaking havoc all over the planet Earth, right? So we need to put an end to global warming, to philosophical global warming, right?
There's still people who say it doesn't, like, global warming doesn't exist. Like, all morals are fine.
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, the whole point is there are also all sorts of people that say global warming is not really a problem, right? So, but there's a kind of, this is just, I think it's an analogy that might be helpful for understanding it. In some sense, the reason I say it, in part to be funny, but in part, if you think about it, it's just like global warming. And I remember I went to the global warming conference with the Queen of Green the other week, and there's a Queen of Green on campus, isn't there?
Is that your title for it?
Yeah. I don't even remember her real name. I just call her the Queen of Green at this point. But in this whole thing that was going on, all these students started standing up and giving witness. This one guy stood up and he was like, "Everybody out there, global warming. I just want to say I'm so happy you all came to this seminar, and just do what you can. Do what you can to put an end to global warming." Almost like a Protestant preacher. But it's true. If you could even they show this Al Gore movie, but even the way they show the movie, it's like his conversion story to be a global warming activist. It is. It's like I lost my faith and now I'm a global warming nut, right? And the thing is that in the end, I'll grant you. I mean, in the end, if global warming is a problem, we'll solve it. I'm not too worried about it actually, because the human person can, over time, eventually figure these things out. And I'm all for having all the global warming activists take cold showers to eliminate all the coal that they burn by forcing these electric companies to warm water for them. You know, I mean, if they're going to put their money where their mouth is, they should take cold showers. And they should. They should. It would be a very practical way that they could reduce their contribution to the problem of global warming. But I also think, actually, if you think about it, I mean, I think this is also true. If we were truly living virtue, we wouldn't be such passion-driven consumers. And so if we weren't such passion-driven consumers, we would probably use less resources and global warming would be less of a problem. You know, so virtue in some sense is a way to solve the problem of global warming. And that's why modern philosophy is, that's why philosophical global warming is our biggest problem. Yeah. But the thing is, I mean, even independently, I'll grant you whatever you want to say about the real scientific effects of global warming and whatnot, because certainly there's some sort of certainly there might be some sort of a danger about it, right? Or even if it's just natural processes that now things are really hot and they used to be really cold, well, still the human person has to adjust to them, and the way the human person adjusts to them is through virtue.
Well, I liked his argument that if global warming keeps going at the rate it is, then we're going to have another ice age.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, that just solves the problem, doesn't it?
Right. No more global warming.
Hey, and then by the time we repopulate the face of the earth, there'll be all sorts of natural resources again.
Yeah, the other thing he says is that then he says population is the problem, and then 2 paragraphs later he says the countries which are the biggest contributors to global warming are the United States and Western Europe. Well,
where population is the most
significant. Yeah. So population is not the problem, right? But he had to say that to get money from the pro-abortion Planned Parenthood people that are using the IMF and the World Bank to shove condoms down our throats.
Did you know at Purdue,
right?
Each student gets 10 free condoms a day through health?
I'm sorry.
Ten?
No, they do.
10.
Not our throats, but the third.
He just said,
That's
or
ridiculous.
showing
If
them
you
other
want.
places.
Really hard.
Oh, man.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, not really, but I mean.
They get 10 a day. Whoa.
Wait, what?
10 what?
At Purdue, each
They
student
get
is
3 a day at NC State.
each student is allotted 10 condoms per day at health services.
That's a
Wow.
lot.
So they have to go pick them up. They don't get them dropped off at the door or something.
No,
Yeah, if you
Okay.
Well, I had a friend that got fired as an RA from Columbia because he wouldn't make them available on his door. So he was fired.
You should have said put the holes in them.
Yeah, that's
Terrible.
right.
That's
That's right. Are they? They're not bad then, right? Like you could disable them, and then there would only be intent would be bad, but overall.
I was kidding. I do not take this seriously.
Okay, we're all being recorded
No,
here.
that's such a good idea. It's just Catholic
It's a
Church
little
should come out
unhygienic.
with non-contraceptive.
Is it a mortal sin to attempt to kill someone?
Anyway, let's go on. Let's move on. We've said too much. We've all said too much.
We've gone too far.
Yeah. Don't take that seriously.
So,
Sabotage.
So it's gonna be on the internet.
That was John Bertocci.
And we don't post this one.
That was a minority.
Within the minority.
It's not even my opinion. I'm just saying.
Now we're back to it.
now the last big concern of the Nocturnal Council, he says, is that they know the truth about the laws, they can interpret the laws, and they can defend them in speech and in deed, that they can judge them by the standard of nature, and they can encourage everybody to do things in a noble fashion. This is at 966b. And that's a nice little summary, I think, of Plato's philosophy. Right? That we know the truth about things, that we defend it in speech and deed, that we judge actions against the standard of nature, and that we always strive to do what is noble. One of the noblest things the Nocturnal Council will do is they will show that God exists, that he governs providentially, and that we can trust him. Pistis. He comes back to pistis, by the way, I discovered again. Pistis, if pistis means proof. Proof is what you argue for. It's an argument that you give such that you can trust. Not only believe and trust the person who gives the argument at the same time. Right? Because ultimately, philosophy is a way of life. And a way of life involves entrusting yourself to a guide who will lead you to what is true and good. So even philosophy requires belief. You can't have philosophy without belief. So this notion that you can do philosophy just as logic, not as a way of life, is a false notion. Because even the person that says, I'm just going to give you logical arguments on the board, right? Even if some professor at UNLV were to do that, I'm just going to give you logical arguments and just show you how to argue. Well, he's still, in a way, I think he's going to let a way of life, that is itself a way of life, right? That I can on the one hand say, we do logical arguments and then I just live my life, even though there's no defense of it. Ultimately, you have to defend your way of life. Even if you do it in a very simple Joe Sixpack way, you have to defend your way of life. You do by your very words and speech and deeds, right? You defend your life. You're always judging your life and your actions by some sort of standard. And so the philosopher that we should trust, or the nocturnal council that we should trust, is the Roman Curia. It's right here. It's at 960D. Well, no, it's those who are able to provide a proof that is worthy of belief. And the most important things that they can speak to us about are the soul. How God creates the soul. How divine intelligence orders all things. They can warn us about the dangers of any kind of determinism or any kind of materialistic view of the soul. This is at 967B, right? A and B. The problem with materialist atheists, he says, and this is what the Roman Curia or the Nocturnal Council can point out, is that the atheists have difficulty showing us that we are even human, right? Let alone capable of the divine. And atheists, if you let them, they will infect men and poets. And they will lead the poets to deride philosophy and distort it. Right? So these people need to be kept, actually, in the Nocturnal Council and the laws. These people are deviants. They are potential corruptors of society, so that they need to be kept in prison or always under the watch of the guardians. Anne Hendershot is a sociologist at San Diego University, I think is where she writes. And she recently wrote a book called Deviancy. And the point of her book, she says, is that every society always has 10% deviancy. No matter what. I mean, deviancy is a constant. The real question is, who are the deviants? Right? Who are the 10% deviants? And her point is that you see this in the United States happening in the last 50 years or so. Those people who in the 19th century would be in that 10% deviant position are now in the elite positions, the leadership positions. Using Plato's language, the deviants are now in the Nocturnal Council. And then actually Anne Hendershot's point, and she's just saying this as a sociologist, her point is that actually the category of people that now fits in the deviant category more and more in the United States is the Catholics. Right? In other words, the deviant is someone whose ideas are dangerous. The deviant is someone who could be unsettling for the rest of people in society. The deviant is someone who's being punished either by the tax system or by the legal system to keep them down. And she says, well, sociologically speaking, the Catholics fit all those categories. Every other religious group can basically control the public schools in their community. Catholics have to start their own and pay a tax, just like in Islamic countries. Actually, Catholics in America have to pay about the same kind of a tax that Catholics have to pay in Islamic countries to preserve their way of life. In Islamic countries, it's just that if you want to remain Catholic, you got to pay this tax. For Catholics, if you want to preserve your way of life through schools, you got to pay the tax. You got to pay the double price. Or you
It's
can
getting better, isn't it?
no.
I thought-
Well, but the thing is like now, for example, New York City is opening up Arabic schools, right? Where basically they're going to teach Islam in the schools,
Wow.
under the guise of teaching of having an Arabic culture dominate. And they also have Hebrew schools, where the Jewish culture dominates, but they basically teach the Jewish religion. And they have Indonesian schools, where again the Muslim culture dominates. They have Chinese schools, where the Confucian religion dominates. They have Indian schools, where Hindu dominates. But you can't have Catholics. You can't have like Irish schools, right, where the Catholic religion would dominate. Well, because why? Also, Irish studies in this country is being taken over by the Marxists, or now the deconstructionists or postmodernists, whatever you want to call them. Right? So, in a way, what Hendershot is saying is that we have the opposite of what Plato sets up in the Nocturnal Council. The Nocturnal Council, their whole point is to say, who are the true deviants, and let's keep them in the deviant position. And Hendershot is saying, if you don't do that, if you don't identify the deviants and put them there, what will happen is those people who are not deviants will be put in the deviant position. Because deviancy is a social constant throughout history. You're always going to have a segment of the population which is considered deviant. So better to identify the deviants and put them there rather than to have other people manipulated into the deviant position. So, the two big things that the poets should do and that the Nocturnal Council should do. They should help us see how the soul exists and is immortal, and how the soul should rule over our bodies. Then, they should help us see that being is intelligible, and that our job is not to create ideas and to impose them on the community, but is to discover the truth of things, and then conforms ourself, basically to harmonize ourselves with the things that are true. If we do this, we will have a Nocturnal Council that puts first, this is 969a. If we do this, we will have a Nocturnal Council which puts first education and the upbringing of children. And, since it puts education and the upbringing of children first, it will always find itself safeguarding virtue. And then he ends saying, and what we touched on in speech a little while ago as a dream, when we somehow mix together a certain image of a community of head and intelligence, will be almost a perfected waking vision, if, that is, our men have been mixed with precision, properly educated, and once educated, dwell in the country's acropolis as perfected guardians, whose like, with regard to the virtue of safeguarding, we have not seen come into being in our lives previously. Right? So he's saying, if we can mix together, proper understanding of things with true prudence, we will have guardians in our society who are well educated and who will basically take education as being the most important thing, and the most important thing being education and virtue. And then we will have a society, we will have a city that we have not yet seen, right? Our eyes have not seen, nor have our ears heard. So that's the laws.